Hello and welcome back to our second lesson in Christian worship here, our summer online course. Our second lesson will be Old Testament worship. Before we get started, just a few reminders. Everything is on Canvas, including the syllabus, the schedule, the rubrics for all of your projects. I'm also going to put on there all of these PowerPoints as well. So if you want to flip back, you can do so at your own leisure. Remember to do the readings. Usually that is read the chapter in our textbook and then answer half the questions. Don't forget to also put in something there from the video lecture so that I know that you watched the lecture. If you notice, that first lesson was just write a paragraph summary. There was no questions for the intro. Also remember that when we get to the assignments that are not from the textbook, that there's a document on Canvas that says non-textbook readings, the questions, answer all the questions for there, and then also put in something from the video lecture. Just my way of making sure that you do the assignments and also that you're watching the video lectures. Okay, let's get in to lesson 2, Old Testament worship. We need to start with the difference between Old and New Testament worship. And the main difference is timeline. So if you're worshiping in the Old Testament, you are worshiping something that is symbolic, that is going to come true at a later date. It's the same worship, it's the same faith, it's the same message. Just if you're in the Old Testament, you're looking forward to the Messiah who is going to come and fulfill the pictures of the Old Testament and fulfill the promise of salvation by sacrificing himself on the cross to pay the price for the sins of the world. If you're on the other side of Jesus Christ on the timeline, then you are worshiping what has already been accomplished. And so the symbols of the Old Testament that we're going to see, like the sacrifices and the washing rituals, those were pictures of what was to come. That was a part of your worship. But in the New Testament, your worship is about the reality of what has already been accomplished. So, for example, the sacrifice of the Old Testament is a picture of the coming sacrifice of Jesus Christ. In the New Testament, for instance, Holy Communion is actually a delivering of that forgiveness of sins that has already been accomplished. So it's a matter of timeline, but it's also a matter of prediction and prophecy and picture in the Old Testament and the real deal in the New Testament. Let me give you an example. Let's imagine that you're sitting in front of me and I pull an Oprah on you. And that is, I'm going to give all of you an extravagant gift. And that gift is going to be a new vehicle, a new car. And in fact, you get to pick the car. You get to pick all of the accessories. You get to pick all of the bells and whistles for the model that you choose. Some of you choose a pickup truck. Some of you a sports car. Maybe some of you will pick some old-fashioned car from the 50s. Now, the cars are not going to be delivered today. But what I'm going to give you after I gather all of this information is I'm going to give you a nice shiny catalog, which has the picture of the model of your car, the right color that you have chosen, all the accessories, all of the bells and whistles. You have this glossy brochure, this nice little catalog, this beautiful picture of the gift that is to come. This is like the Old Testament. Sacrifices and the washings and the pictures of Christ that is to come. But then one day, the cars are delivered to you and you get the keys and now you have the real deal. This is like the New Testament. Now you actually have the thing that has been promised. You don't just have the picture of it, you still have the thing. It's the same worship, it's the same idea, it's the same gift. Now it is in reality. And there's something to think about too, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. When you're in the New Testament, you don't need the pictures anymore. Just like you don't need the catalog anymore because you have the car right now. And so all of these Old Testament pictures of sacrifices and washing rituals and the law of circumcision, those aren't needed anymore when you have the real deal. And one of the problems in the early New Testament worship was people wanted to hold on to the old customs. And they can often fall into the idea that they have to do these Old Testament customs in order to get the actual forgiveness of sins. That would be work righteousness. You do something in order to gain something from God. But it also fails to realize that these are pictures that then are fulfilled. You have the real deal now. And if you just hold on to the picture, then you end up going through the motions. Then it has no meaning. It has no fulfillment. So, for instance, St. Paul talks to the Christians in Galatia. He says, you're saved by grace alone. You don't have to do any works. All of these Old Testament pictures are now fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And they're like, great, we are free. We don't have to do anything. We can live our life as God made us to be, that is righteous in Christ. But then came along somebody who said, but you still need to circumcise your boys. You still need to follow this custom. And the custom became an empty ritual. It became a work righteous thing. And St. Paul wrote a letter to the Galatians scolding them for that. He said, I free you. Why are you putting yourself back under this law where you think you have to earn something to get God's favor? Not only is it false doctrine, not only does it put you out of freedom back into prison, but you misunderstood the pictures of the Old Testament as well. Why hold on to the catalog when you actually have the car right now? You have the gift given to you. So the difference between Old and New Testament worship, it's a timeline thing, but it's also a thing to understand about pictures and realities. The New Testament is the reality. The Old Testament was the picture of what was to come. So how did they worship in the Old Testament? Well, we need to start in Eden. We need to start in Genesis like we do all things. Adam and Eve worshiped God, but the question is, how? And can we learn something from their worship, even in our New Testament worship today? I think so. I would go so far as to say that there was a church in Eden. And the church was the first church of Eden, and it was two trees. If you remember the story, there's two trees in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, when they approached God, or rather, when God encountered them, they were given some commands. They were to eat from the tree of life, but they were to not eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And right here, we see the core of worship. We forgot to talk about this in the first lesson, so we'll bring it up here. And that is that worship finally is trust. That's how the Lutheran confessions, and I would say the Bible, defines true worship. That you trust that God is going to give you good things. Remember, worship is a terrible word for what happens on Sunday morning. It's not about us feeding God's fragile ego, but it is about God giving us good things. So Adam and Eve got good things from God. They ate from the tree of life. He spoke to them and he ate with them. Now let's stop right there. Let's think about who we are as human beings. That is how God created us. We've already noticed that we are people who worship, whether we're religious or not. We all have a number one. We all have an ultimate thing. And to find that ultimate thing, we take a liturgical audit. We find out where our calendar goes. Where does our time go? Where does our money, our offerings go? Where do we find our identity? How would we ask the question, who are we? So when God made us, he made us eaters and listeners. Think about it. This is how we interact with people. We are people of words. God created us with his word. He created us to interact primarily with words with each other, and we are to take him at his word as he speaks to us. Think about the Tower of Babel situation. When God came to mess up our human desire to be like God. He did not send down legions of angels to destroy the tower that the people of Babel were building. He messed with their words. Words are so very important. And so we are people of words. We interact with God and with each other with words, and we're to take God at his word. This is the primary focus of worship. We trust him. We hear his word. We talk back to him. We trust his word as he speaks to us. Another thing about us human beings is that we are people of food. We eat. Not only do we eat for survival, but we eat in a spiritual way. That sounds kind of strange to our American ears, but think about it. Think about all the great events in your life. There probably was a meal. You went to a wedding, even a funeral. You gathered together as a family, family reunions, Thanksgiving dinners. There's almost always food. I would suggest that no matter what your culture, no matter where you come from, that when you get together as a family, you do three things: you eat, you drink, and you speak. Well, that's exactly what the family of God does when they gather together on Sundays. There will be a lot of words as we talk about our most famous brother, Jesus of Nazareth, and what he has done for us. But he also feeds us. We eat and we drink. This is how we commune with each other. And think about it. You invite certain people to a wedding, and certain people don't get invited to a wedding. When you break bread with somebody, there's an implication that you are one with them. It's a spiritual thing. So hard for us Americans to understand. And that is because one way we look at ourselves is through biology primarily. We're human beings, we're like animals or maybe even machines, and we put food into our body as if it was fuel. Think about taking a road trip and you see a billboard that says, stop by this gas station, fill up your tank, and fill up your tank, not just the tank of your car, but your tank. And they want to feed you, give you water, buy cheap snacks, that kind of thing. It's the idea that we're putting fuel into our body. Think of professional athletes right now, so concerned with how much sleep they get, what do they put in their body, how do they work out, all of those things. They see themselves and their bodies primarily as machines. And they often become health nuts. Why? Because you don't put regular unleaded gas into a Lamborghini. They are thinking themselves as machine. And so food becomes this thing that feeds the body, this machine or this animal. But this is contrary to the rest of the world and contrary certainly to the history of the world. The ancients thought eating was very, very important. In fact, you never ate alone. If you ate alone, that would be weird. We eat alone all the time because we're just thinking about putting fuel into our body. When the ancients ate, they broke bread, and it was a spiritual fellowship thing. When you broke bread with somebody, there was more than a physical connection. There was a soul connection. There was a spiritual connection. And even us jaded Americans who just put fuel like food like fuel into our bodies, our machines, we still have special meals. We still take pictures of our food and put them on social media. We still gather together for Thanksgiving and wedding feasts and all of this kind of stuff. It matters, doesn't it? So when God created human beings and set up a way that they would commune with each other and commune with him, eating played an important role throughout the Old Testament, and we see it at the first church of Eden as well. So notice, he speaks and he eats. Those are the primary things of worship: speaking and eating. Now remember that other tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the tree they were not supposed to eat from. That was another act of trust. They were supposed to think, okay, God has given us this command not to keep something from us, but to protect us. He was saying, this is not your business. There's something bigger than you. Just trust me. I'm going to respect you enough to say that there's something out there so that you're not ignorant, but you need to trust me. Don't try to be like me. Just trust me. And so when they worshiped in Eden, they ate and they heard and they trusted. No wonder then that the devil comes and attacks their worship and says, don't trust God. You can be like him, knowing good and evil. And so they ate. They ate from the wrong tree. They messed up their worship and their trust. They tried to be like God. And they would know good and evil. They would know it in a different way. They would become evil. So notice how the devil still comes to us today. He attacks our worship. That is, what is your most important thing? Are you going to trust God at his word and receive good things from him? Or are you going to go your own way and make your own God? It's the same problem and the same worship still today. A little bit further in the story of Genesis, we get the first murder, which is the first fratricide, the murder of a brother. You know the story of Cain and Abel. Cain and Abel were the sons of Adam and Eve, and they were told to worship God by bringing a sacrifice. Now, Abel was a rancher, a farmer who had livestock, and so he had lambs. Cain was a grain farmer primarily. Now, no doubt they exchanged things. No doubt Abel needed to feed his flock and maybe bought some grain from Cain. And no doubt Cain also needed meat. He needed wool. And so he traded with Abel. I think that's a fair description of what was going on there. When we pick up the story, we have a story of worship. And the worship is they're supposed to bring a sacrifice. Abel brings blood. He brings lamb. Cain brings his grain. So far, so good. Nothing wrong with that, except maybe one thing. Notice that Cain brought grain and Abel brought blood. Now, we are told that Cain's sacrifice is not accepted by God and Abel's is. And the primary reason is because Abel trusted God and Cain did not. Cain was bringing this sacrifice because he was doing something for God, expecting something in return. It was a work righteousness sort of worship. He does something for God, and then God pays the proper wages to him. It's a wage system. This system is where you are the worker and God is the boss. And you do something and God pays the proper wages. If you do well, you get blessing. If you do poorly, you get a curse. This is what was in the mind of Cain. It was not true worship. Abel understood that he was not in a business relationship with God, a wage system, but rather a gift system, a righteousness by faith. He trusted God, and God made him righteous through the coming Messiah, Jesus Christ. And so notice that Abel comes trusting God, true worship. But I think there's something else going on here, and I can't prove it, but I think it's there in the background. Abel brought blood, and Cain just brought grain. Abel understood that this was a picture of the coming Messiah, so there would be blood. Where Cain was just going through the motions, he was paying God something so that he would get something in return. Well, you know the rest of the story and how their worship got messed up, and so did their real life. Cain became jealous of Abel and kills his brother, and Cain is banished. So just put that in the back of your mind there, that worship is so important, and it affects our real life as it did with Cain and Abel. All right. Let's fast forward a little bit to Old Testament worship and talk about the temple. If you remember the story, after the Israelites came out of Egypt, they were given a command to worship God, and they built a tabernacle, which was a tent-like structure. Eventually, that tabernacle would turn into the temple. Eventually, there would be a solid structure built by Solomon many, many, many years later. But the tabernacle structure and the temple structure were one in the same. Now, as you look at the picture of this temple, you see that there are quite a few buildings in different courtyards. That tall building in the back, that's the holy place and the most holy place. We'll talk about those in a little bit. That inner courtyard around that tall building is where the priests would go. They would work there. They would offer sacrifices. They would do the business of the liturgy and sing and pray on behalf of the people. That inner courtyard that you see right in the middle of the picture, that would have been the courtyard of the men of Israel. So this is where the men would gather. They would talk. They would hear preaching. They would hear the prayers of the temple. They would conduct the business of the religion of Israel there. The next courtyard was the courtyard of the Israelite women and children. So notice all the barriers before you could get into the presence of God. And that final outer courtyard was the Gentile courtyard. Let's just talk about a few things here, why that's so important. When God came to earth, he came through the people of Israel, his special people, to bring the Messiah, who would be the Messiah for everybody. It wasn't just for the Israelites, it was for everybody, but it was a real person. And so it had to be brought from a real tribe, a real people that had a specific land, specific flesh and blood. And the idea there was that God would come, but there would be barriers to you, between you and God. And the barrier can only be broken down by the sacrifice of the Messiah. So here's the idea. Sinners don't go to heaven. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. If sinners went to heaven, then it would be this world all over again. So the way God works is that he makes you worthy of heaven. He makes you sinless. He makes you righteous. How? By sending his son to live the perfect life to replace your imperfect life and die the perfect death to pay the price for your sins. So you are made worthy of heaven. Sinners don't go to heaven. The problem is we're all sinners. So God makes us sinless through the blood of Christ. Now, underneath all of that is the idea that you cannot come into the presence of a holy God. He would blow you away. He's holy and perfect and righteous, and you are not. So the only way to come into the presence of God is through a mediator. This is all a picture of Jesus Christ being the high priest, the mediator. His sacrifice cleanses us so we have access to God. So in the Old Testament, we have a picture of what is going to be the New Testament reality. So this gets played out with all these courtyards. And the farther you get from the holy place, that's where God dwelled, we'll come to that in a minute, the closer you got, then the closer you were to God. And so there's all these barriers. If you lived halfway across the world, you were far from the temple. You were not close to God because God came in a specific way. Yes, God is everywhere, but he seeks to be found in a specific place. Let's go down that road, a little tangent just for a second. Yes, God is everywhere. He's in nature. He's everywhere. He's omniscient. But you don't find his grace and love in nature. In fact, if you look in nature, you see a lot of horror. You see hurricanes and typhoons and death and blood and all this awful stuff. So God does not want us to seek him in nature. He wants us to seek him where he wants to be sought. In the New Testament, that is his word, his meal, his washing, his absolution. There we have the promises of the forgiveness of sins. In the Old Testament, there was a specific location, the temple. So if you're out in the world, you were very far from God. Yes, God was everywhere and his word could create faith, but the presence of God was far off from you. If you got into the Holy Land, you were closer. That land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. If you got to the holy city, Jerusalem, you were getting closer. If you went to the Temple Mountain, then you got even closer. If you were a Gentile, you could get into the first courtyard, but there you had to stop. If you were a woman or a child, then you got to the Israelites tribe, you could get a little bit closer. If you were a male, you could get a little bit closer. If you were a priest, you could get into that inner courtyard. And if you were a priest on duty, you could go into the building. And if you were the high priest, then you could get into the final room where God was. Now, let's look ahead. When Jesus died on the cross, the barrier between these two inner rooms, we'll show a picture of that in a second, was a big curtain, and that curtain that curtain ripped in two when Jesus died, symbolizing that we have access to God through the sacrifice of Christ. A couple other things before we move on. One is that there would be a wash basin in the inner courtyard for ceremonial washing, and there would be an altar where the sacrifices were made. All right, let's take a closer look to the inner part of the temple. Here's a cutout of that building that you saw in the previous picture. If you notice the altar where the sacrifices were made, think a big barbecue. And then you see the big wash basin, and perhaps in this artist's depiction, smaller wash basins that would be taken out where ceremonial washings would occur. Then inside the building, you see two rooms. That first room is called the Holy Place. And then into the far left, you see that place that looks like it has an altar, and then it also has these creatures with wings on it. That was the most holy place. In the most holy place was the Ark of the Covenant. We'll show a picture of that a little bit later. Think about this as the throne of God. This is where God was. Yes, God is spirit. Yes, he is everywhere, but this is where he seeks to be found. In the other room, the holy place, you have an altar of incense. Smoke would be burned and symbolizing prayer going up into heaven. There would be a table with 12 loaves of bread, 12 loaves for the 12 tribes of Israel. This was the bread of presence. God is the bread of life. He is present there. And then you would have a candelabra. We'll call them a menorah today. At least one. This artist depiction has multiple ones, where oil lamps, these are oil lamps that would be burning nonstop. This is a picture of God being the light of the world, the light in a dark world. Notice, by the way, these are symbols of Christ. He is the bread of life. He is the light of the world. So the courtyard, that's where the priests would do their business. If you were the priest on duty for that day, you would go into that first room and you would burn incense, you would say prayers, you would make sure that there was oil in the oil lamps. Imagine the mysticism of that room. It's smoky and smells fragrant, and there's these lights that you can see flickering through the midst. It was a very holy, mystical place. Once a week, they would trade out the bread as well. This was what the priest on duty did. The high priest would go into that inner sanctuary only once a year on the Day of Atonement. There he would kill a lamb, sacrificing him for the sins of the whole nation of Israel. Then there would be a goat, and it's called the scapegoat. This is where we get the term scapegoat. And the idea there was that the sins of the nation would be put on the goat, and the goat would be released out of Jerusalem. So the sin goes away from the holy place, because you can't have sin in a holy place, otherwise it wouldn't be holy. Both of these symbolize Christ, of course, the Lamb who dies for us, but also remember that Jesus went outside the city walls to be crucified. He takes the sin of the people outside of the holy place, and that's where he dies. All right, here are some pictures of the furniture within the temple. You see the priest there. He is standing before the altar, the table of bread. So you see the 12 loaves of unleavened bread, symbolizing the tribes of Israel, but also symbolizing that God is our bread. He gives us what we need. In the right, we have the altar of incense. Incense was burned, symbolizing prayer and God's presence. In the bottom, you have the menorah. You have the lamps with oil in them that would always be lit. God is the light of the world. Then in the center there, you have what's called the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant was an acacia wood box overlaid with gold. And you see two angels there on top. They act as the throne of God. So you can imagine God sitting on these angels. This is his throne. This is where God is. Inside the box was a jar of manna, the tablets of the Ten Commandments, and the staff of Moses. So the history of Israel and how God worked through them, those artifacts were kept in there. If you remember your Old Testament history, this Ark of the Covenant was in the tabernacle, would go out to war often with Israel. So God was with them. But you also remember that curious story of King David carrying the ark to Jerusalem, the city, the capital city of Israel. He was moving the presence of God to the capital city. And there he had planned on building a temple. He would not, his son Solomon would. When they took the ark to Jerusalem, if you remember the story, they had the Ark of the Covenant on a cart pulled by oxen. This was their first mistake. There was a rule that nobody should touch the Ark of the Covenant. After all, this is the throne of God. Can you imagine going up to a king or king and just touching the throne? You wouldn't make it that far. The soldiers would stop you. And so they carried it with these poles, and only certain people from the tribe of Levi were allowed to touch these poles. So they got him like a sack of potatoes on a cart pulled by oxen. They have insulted God. The oxen stumble, the cart breaks down, as you remember the story, and a guy named Uzzah tries to catch the ark from falling to the ground, which seems like a nice thing to do, but he touched the throne of God, and God killed him on the spot. It seems a little harsh, but when we think about it, you don't get to touch God with your uncleanness. You don't get to touch his throne. They were messing around. They didn't understand the symbolism of this. Okay, so here are the four main pieces of furniture in the holy place and the most holy place. Let's talk about the priests for a second. The priests came from the tribe of Levi. So the Levites were set apart. They did not own land in the Holy Land, but they were set apart and they were going to do the work of God. So they symbolize Christ as well, right? One of the Israelites separate to do the work of sacrifice. From the tribe of the Levites would come the priests, and specifically the high priest. And the high priest had some different garb. And that garb, as you see before, is pretty fancy. The breastplate is the one that I want to talk about for a little bit. You notice that there's 12 jewels there symbolizing the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, the high priest function was to be the mediator between God and the people. This is a picture of Christ, right? Christ is the mediator between us and the Father. When he dies, we have access to the Father, who is one with the Son, and so we have access to God because our high priest is God himself. But before Christ comes, we have this picture of the high priest who is going to speak to God on behalf of the people and speak on behalf of God to the people in a way. You have the prophets who did this as well, but liturgically, this is what the priests did. So the high priest was in charge of the sacrifices and the washing rituals. And then on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, as we mentioned before, he makes a special sacrifice for the sins of the whole nation. And in that way, he cleanses the nation of their sin. And so they have access to God through him. Notice that when Christ comes, you don't need the priest anymore because we have a high priest who is God. You don't need the temple anymore. You don't need the sacrifices anymore because the sacrifice of Christ fulfills all of those. The other priests would do the duties of the temple on a regular day basis as well. But there's also this curious picture of the whole nation being a priesthood. The picture here is that God's special people are the mediators between God and the world. How else are they going to know about God? How else are the nations, the Gentiles, going to know about God except through the nation of Israel that speaks the truth of God handed down to them? So maybe one thing to think about before we go further. We think about Israel as this separate nation, and rightfully so. But it's not like they had their own God and everybody else had their other gods. No, their God was the true God. Other tribes, other nations, they had their different gods, and And they thought Israel's God was just fine, just like all the other gods, and there was a competition. But all these other ancient religions knew that there was something. There was a prime mover, a prime God, a creator God out there unknown. If you remember St. Paul, when he goes to Athens and he talks in the Areopagus, he says to the people, I see that you are very religious and you have all of these different temples and altars, and you even have an altar to the unknown God, that thing you know is out there, but you can't quite put your finger on. Let me tell you about this known God. He's actually known, and all these other gods are fake. They're just stone, right? And so Israel's God is the true God that they're all looking for, that they all know exists. And so Israel becomes the ambassador of the true God to the world and says, there actually is a creator God, and he can be known, and he speaks to us. He speaks to us, going back again to the idea that God has created us to know him through words. And so the great joy of Israel is that their Messiah gets to be everybody's Messiah. And so the message of Christ told to the Israelites means that the whole nation is a priesthood, a mediator between God and the people through these words. They were to be a beacon of human rights in a very debaucherous, violent, ancient Near East world. They were to be the ones that told the truth about God. And so they were inclusive in that way. Everybody could be Jewish religiously, so to speak, even if they didn't have Jewish blood, because their Messiah would be everybody's Messiah. All right, let's talk about some rituals. Let's talk about the washings first off. Now, when we think about sin, we think about sin in a couple different ways. One, we think about it in a forensic way, that is a legal way. There's a trespass, a law has been broken, and there needs to be an acquittal. This is fulfilled in the New Testament through absolution. You confess your sins, and the pastor says, I forgive you. You are forgiven. You're acquitted of the charges. Another way we think about it is a disease or a corruption. We have this thing in us, this sinfulness. It's who we are. It's a disease. It's in our DNA, so to speak. That is taken care of in Holy Communion, which has often been talked about as the medicine of immortality. So we get the medicine, we get a fix of the corruption. Another way we think about it, sin, is that we are dirty, we are unclean. It's something we don't really get in America too much, but the rest of the world really does understand this. Not just that when you commit sin, you feel dirty, but when sins are committed against you, you can think of just heinous things where your innocence is lost, whether it be by abuse. You feel not only abused, but you feel like something has been taken from your soul. Like if somebody broke into your household, you would feel violated, let alone if your body was violated. And people often describe this as being made unclean, even though it wasn't their fault. And so the idea of being saved of this uncleanness is to be washed. And so there were sacrifices, there was absolution that correspond to Holy Communion and absolution today in the New Testament worship, but there was also washings, which corresponds to baptism in the New Testament. Now, in order to really understand this, we have to go through a few things about law and about the clean, unclean distinction. First of all, let's start on the left with this idea of the types of law. The first type of law is the moral law. The moral law always stands. Think the 10 Commandments. Think about this. It's always wrong to punch somebody in the face for no reason. It's always wrong, even if there's no law on the books in your county, state, or nation that says it's wrong. It's just wrong. It's always wrong. This is God's moral law. Then there is the civil law. The civil law is not really about morality or immorality. It's about law and order. It becomes immoral if you break a civil law because you are working against law and order for your community. but in and of itself, it's not necessarily wrong. A perfect example of this is driving on the right side of the road. We have laws in this nation that you're supposed to drive on the right side of the road and not the left side of the road. It's not like there's something immoral or moral about the left or the right. If you go to Australia, you better drive on the left. It's not that they're worse or better than us. You just got to choose one side of the road. These are civil laws. They keep law and order, and God gave them to the ancient Israelites. We have different civil laws now because we're not in ancient Israel. We live in a different time and era. Then there's the ceremonial laws, and there's lots of them. An example of a ceremonial law would be don't eat pork. Another one would be circumcise your boys. Another one would be a washing ritual. Make a sacrifice. All of those are ceremonial laws. Again, they're not about morality or immorality in and of themselves, but they serve a different purpose. The moral law gives us our morality, our grounding, right and wrong. Civil law is about law and order in our world. Ceremonial law is about a theological purpose or a cultural purpose. So one reason God gave ceremonial laws was to keep a hedge around Israel. Think about it. Israel was God's special people to bring about the Messiah. That means that they needed to be their own entity. They needed to be separate. And so a part of this was the cultural differences. They're the ones that didn't eat pork. They're the ones that circumcised their boys. They're the ones that dressed a certain way. They're the ones that wore beards, all of these kinds of things. Now, you may think this is kind of ridiculous. How could cultural laws keep a group of people protected from attacks and from being swallowed up by other cultures? But I'll ask you to watch the opening ceremonies of the next Olympics and ask yourself, where's the contingent from the Moabites or the Edomites or the Hivites or the Jebusites or the Babylonians or any other group that we see in the ancient Near East? They're all gone. They were swallowed up by bigger cultures. The only name that remains is Egypt, but it's a completely different culture. But there will be a contingent from Israel. This worked. It's not just military and law and order that keeps a group combined and safe from the outside tribes that may want to attack them and overtake their land. It's also culture, it's language, it's food, it's those kinds of things. And so Israel was different, and that kept a hedge around them, a fence around them, so that they could one day bring about the Messiah. Once again, once you have the Messiah, you don't need that cultural hedge anymore. In fact, the glory of Israel is that their Messiah gets to be everybody's Messiah. Let's talk sacrifices for a second. These ceremonial laws, again, taught them a theological thing. The lesson was that you needed to be cleansed of sin. You needed to be free from sin, and the going price for freedom is almost always lifeblood. There needed to be a payment for sin. Something had to die. The only thing that could die to pay the price for the sins of the world was God himself. So these sacrifices taught them and became a picture of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. Then the cleanliness. There were distinctions about cleanliness, and they taught theological lessons. So let's move over to the right. The first idea you need to understand about clean and unclean distinctions is that there's this idea of transfer. That if you came into contact with something that was ceremonially unclean, it was as if the uncleanness got transferred to you. So certain things could make you unclean. A disease, a skin disease, anything that had to do with death, but then also things that had to do with life. So if you had a nocturnal emission as a man, that made you unclean. Your menstrual cycle as a woman made you unclean. If you gave birth, you were unclean. So let's think about the theological meaning of this. The first theological lesson is this cannot be helped. It's not like you can stop your cycle. It's not like birth is a bad thing, but you are unclean. If somebody had to take the body of grandma and bury it, that's not a wrong thing, but you were made unclean by touching death. So this cannot be helped. So the lesson is you're sinful, you're unclean, you're sinful, and that cannot be helped. You cannot go through life in a sinful world and not be sinless. You are going to be unclean. Lesson number 2 is that this was handed down through birth. So notice these things that had to do with the cycle of life, not just death, but life, nocturnal emission, menstrual cycle, birth made you unclean. You have the sins, the original sin of your parents is handed down to you. You don't have a choice in the matter. If you're born from two sinful people, you are going to be sinful, and it ends in death. The third theological meaning was you can't clean yourself. You need to be cleansed by an outside source. You cannot save yourself from sin. You need to have God wash you. He is the one that saves you. And so this clean and unclean distinction seems so foreign to us, but there are some very clear, powerful theological lessons there. You cannot help but be unclean. It's handed down through birth and ends in death, and you have to be cleansed by an outside source. That was the priest in the Old Testament. It's Jesus in the New Testament. So they would go through washing rituals. You would be unclean for a while if you had to bury a dead body. Then you had to be washed ceremonially to be brought back into the community and come into the presence of God. The sacrifices. There's different kinds of sacrifices. You don't need to know all of them. The burnt sacrifice is the whole burnt, the whole animal is burned. Grain sacrifice is just that grain. You have a fellowship offering, that when you would come together with different groups and fellowship with God. A sin offering would be for a specific, the specific sinfulness of the Israelites or a group. And the guilt offering was about specific sins if you committed a sin. Now, one thing I want you to know about the sacrifices is that there was always blood. So even if you brought like a grain offering or an offering of wine that you would pour out onto the ground, it was always tied to a blood animal too. The significance being that there had to be a death, right? Now, there was a dual meaning in sacrifices. First was a picture of Jesus Christ who pays the price for the sins of the world, as we have said over and over again. But it's also an offering like an offering today. When I give my offerings to church, I'm not really giving them to God. I'm honoring God for sure, but the offerings go to the community. They benefit me. They benefit those around me. They benefit me in this way. God is teaching me a lesson. He is saying, here's what is important, what is not important. And so when we think about how we deal with our money, think about it this way. Let's say that you get a paycheck for $1,000. You should think in your mind that it's not $1,000, it's $700. Because there's going to be things that are taken off the top. One is going to be for your government. It's going to be taxes. Let's call it 10%. I know it's more than that. Let's call it 10%. And you're a part of a community, and we can argue about whether taxes are used well or not and how we should use them and how much we should be taxed. We're a part of a community, and we pay our fair share. And so that's important. It's outside of ourselves. So that's taken off the top. I think to be wise, you need to save money for your retirement and for a rainy day. Let's take another 10% off, right? You need to be wise about this and not just think that you can spend money today and not have to worry about tomorrow. And then I think there's generosity, whether it be a church or somewhere else. Let's call it 10%. And in each of those things, you're outside of yourself. And what God is doing is saying, here's what is important. There is things that are bigger than you, primarily the work of the gospel. And so what you're saying to God when you give generously, you're saying, you have taught me that there are things more important. Some unsolicited advice from me when you get a budget and you get a job and you have a mortgage and all that kind of stuff. Think about the 70% rule. You don't make $1,000, you make 700, and you'll adjust. you'll be just fine. If you think you make 1,000, you're going to be disappointed and things are going to be tight. But if you know you only make 700, then those monies go to the proper place and you don't worry about them. And it's actually quite a delight to have your finances so strongly controlled that you're saving for tomorrow, that you're being generous, that you're participating in society in the right way. Give enough, though, that last 10%, whatever the number is, and the number doesn't matter. Give to the point where it hurts. Now, I don't mean that you're poor or whatever. I mean that you give more than just the change in your pocket. Give to the point where you've deliberately said, this is important, whatever it is, whatever cause it is that you're going to be generous to. Give to the point where you say, we're going to go to Florida this year for a vacation instead of Cancun. We're not going to get a new car. We're going to buy a used car. We're not going to buy this thing. We're going to settle for this. Why? Because there are things more important than this fleeting world. It teaches you a lesson. It also teaches you to trust. So in the Old Testament believers would bring grain and animals. That would be their offering, not just money. There was a temple tax, but not just money, but their grain and offering. And God commanded their first fruits. And that's hard for us to understand unless you live on a farm. The first fruits is the first part of the harvest. And so any farmer will know that this is a precarious position they're in when the grain is still in the field and not yet harvested, because a hailstorm could come, a fire could come, locusts could come. What God is saying is, give me the first swipe of the combines, the first fruits of the harvest, and just trust me, I'll take care of you. Even if there is a famine, even if there is a hailstorm or locust, just trust me. So if I put this first, God is teaching me to trust. It would be like burning your first 2 paychecks of the year and saying, God, you promised you better take care of me. Even if it's not the way I want, I trust that you'll take care of me. And so our offerings teach something, not just a picture of the coming Messiah for the Old Testament people, but it teaches us something today. What's important and what isn't. Put things in the proper place, penultimate versus ultimate, but also it teaches us to trust him. Ancient Israel also had a calendar, like we have many calendars today. We have a religious calendar, we have a school calendar, we have a sports calendar, we have an economic calendar. And these things compete, don't they? And this is again part of that liturgical audit. Where does your time go? What's more important, this calendar or that calendar? And if we put the penultimate calendars in their proper place, then we don't obsess over them and they don't dominate us. They become the gifts that God has given us. And part of that is making sure that we have a religious calendar in its proper place as well. Now, there was always a rhythm to the Old Testament calendar, and it was a rhythm of sevens. You recall that God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and then he rested on the 7th day. That's the Sabbath. Sabbath just means rest. It's where we get the word sabbatical. So you rest. This is God teaching us not to be workaholics. It's teaching us to enjoy God's good gifts that he has given to us, because left alone, we would work nonstop. It also teaches us to take time and think about where our good gifts come from. And so the Sabbath law was to stop working and think about God. For us today, it's not a specific day. It's go to church, read your Bible, be in contact with God. Take time out for the spiritual. Take time out to appreciate what God has done for you, and know that he's going to give you an eternal Sabbath rest that lasts forever. So the 7-day week that we still have today was a symbol of our life and eternity. You work 6 days and you rest on the 7th day. The problem with the 7-day cycle is there's always a stinking Monday, and we go around and around and around again. And what was elusive was the number 8. And so the number 8 in Scripture had a connection to eternity. Jesus is resurrected on the first day of the week, but it's also the 8th day. And this new resurrected kingdom that he has given to us is like the eternal 8th day, our eternal Sabbath rest that we get in heaven. Not only was there a 7-day week, but there was also the concept of a Sabbath year. And so 7 times 7 would be 49. And so we have these long decades of work, and then on the 50th year would be a year of rest. And it was not that you didn't work all year, but that everything would be restored, the year of Jubilee. This is a picture of Christ's new kingdom that would come, where the deaf would hear and the mute would speak and the blind would see and the disabled would walk again. And so everything is restored. For ancient Israel, it meant any land that was sold during those decades would be brought back to the original family to maintain the tribes and the nation of Israel. Even the land went through a number 7, a rest on the 7th year. So you would work your fields for 6 years, and then you would rotate. That there would always be on the 7th year a field would rest, which was good agriculturally because the nutrients could be replenished. But it was also an idea of God saying, just rest, just trust me, even if you only on a given year use 6 of your 7 fields, just trust me on this and everything will be fine. There are some major days in the church year of ancient Israel. Let's start with the Passover, which happens in the spring, the 1st of Nisan. This recalled the Exodus event, which was the biggest event of the Old Testament. We'll talk about that in depth a little bit later. But this is to recall how God saved them from Egyptian slavery. And if you remember, they were supposed to take a lamb, kill the lamb, and paint the blood on the door frames of their houses, the Israelites, and so that the angel of the Lord would pass over their homes and bring death upon the Egyptian homes. So finally the Pharaoh would let the people go. This was followed by the festival of unleavened bread. If you remember from the story, they were not supposed to eat bread with yeast in it because they didn't have time for it to rise. They had to go once the Pharaoh let them go. And so the flat pita bread. The year of Jubilee, we already talked about. Everything is restored again. The first fruits, also a spring festival, was just that, the first fruits of the spring harvest. They had 2 harvests usually in that climate, fall and spring. So the first fruits would be bringing this to God and thankful for the bread that he had given us. Weeks, or Pentecost, was 50 days. That's where we get the term Pentecost, 50 days after the Passover. So this was another harvest type festival. In the New Testament, it gets fulfilled with the idea of the Holy Spirit coming, bringing the Holy Spirit's message to the world, the harvest of souls. And if you remember in the New Testament, this is when the apostles were able to speak in tongues and the message went out from there. Trumpets, or Rosh Hashanah, is the new year, and it happens in the fall. And so the trumpet blast, another new year under God's grace. Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was very special. As we talked about before, this was about the sacrifice that paid for the price of the whole sins of Israel. This is when the high priest would actually go into the presence of God in the most holy place. Then tabernacles. This is a kind of an important one. The tabernacles was a symbol of how Israel, and specifically God, lived in a tent in the tabernacle. And so still today, some people will go live in tents for a week and to remind themselves of the journey of the Israelites. Purim had to do with, this is a little bit later, we don't find this in Leviticus, but a little bit later in time. Purim had to do with the purification of the temple. And along those lines, we also have Hanukkah, which would have been a festival that came in the intertestamental period and late Old Testament period, but Jesus would have celebrated it as well. It's called dedication in the New Testament, and it talks about the oil never running out in the temple, even though Gentiles had occupied the temple. We don't need to know all of these for the test or anything. just the point is, number one, there is a calendar. We are people of time and space. We always have a calendar that occupies our time. Number two, there is the idea of rest and the cycle of being at peace with God. Don't be a workaholic. Remember the great events, commemorate the great events of salvation. And then finally, this is all pointing ahead to Jesus, right? He's the Passover lamb. He's the first fruits. He is the one who atones us. He is the one who took on flesh and lived in a tabernacle of flesh, a tent, so that he could save us. All right, next week we'll get into New Testament worship and talk about how Christ is the center of all of it.